Hello, listeners. I'm Kathy Fang with Below the Radar, a knowledge democracy podcast. Below the Radar is recorded on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. On this episode of Below the Radar B-Sides, our host Am Johal is joined by Kelsey Gallagher, senior researcher with Project Ploughshares. They chat about Kelsey's work with Ploughshares on Canadian arms export control policies and Bill C-233, or the No More Loopholes Act. Enjoy the episode.
Hello, welcome to Below the Radar. Delighted that you could join us again this week. We have our special guest, Kelsey Gallagher, with us. Welcome, Kelsey.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Kelsey, maybe we can begin with you introducing yourself a little bit.
Sure. So my name is Kelsey Gallagher, and I'm senior researcher with Project Ploughshares. Ploughshares is one of Canada's oldest peace research organizations. And we do a host of research and advocacy related to topics on peace and security and disarmament. We have a number of research portfolios, which includes nuclear disarmament, emerging technology, space security, the protection of civilians, as well as my own research area, which is we would call the conventional arms trade and export controls more generally.
Yeah. Kelsey, I wonder if you can share a little bit how long you've been working in this area and what brought you into this work.
Yeah, so I started actually as an intern with Ploughshares about 7 years ago. In the years prior to that, I had completed my master's in peace and conflict studies. I did some work in the UK with a similar disarmament organization, ended up moving back to Canada. And Ploughshares needed some support on our conventional arms file. So one of the things that Ploughshares does do is we maintain records of all of Canada's arms exports to a very kind of particular degree. And the individual that maintained these records for nearly 30 years, a good friend of mine, some of your listeners probably know, Ken Epps. Ken had retired, and so they were looking for someone to start supporting on the conventional arms file. And the rest is history.
Yeah. And today I wanted to speak with you a little bit about Bill C-233, which is a private member's bill put forward by Member of Parliament Jenny Kwan, but it seems to be responding to the advocacy of organizations who have been calling for changes to the arms trade in Canada in terms of the way Canadian arms move to places internationally that violate or are implicated in human rights violations. I'm wondering if you can sort of speak to framing Bill C-233, which has already been through first reading. It will be coming back for a vote at second reading later in February of 2026. And this episode will be coming out in mid-January. So there'll be a lot of, I think, conversations wrapping up about this. But maybe if you could just help with contextualizing Bill C-233 and why you think it's important, and also maybe some historical background in legislation that's passed historically and kind of where these gaps were that were left inside of it.
Sure thing. Yeah, so Bill C-233, which is also known as the No More Loopholes Act, endeavors to close a series of loopholes that allow for Canadian arms exports to permeate around the world without any oversight. And so I'm happy to give a bit of context. So when we say arms exports, what we're referring to is conventional weapons. So this could be everything from firearms to bullets to tanks to bombs, everything that you would see used in conflict zones from Gaza to Ukraine currently. Canada's arms control regime, its export control system, requires that all arms exports, with an asterisk, and that's what we'll get to, but all of its arms exports require a case-by-case assessment by officials within our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Global Affairs Canada, to assess whether or not, broadly speaking, those proposed arms exports would result in human rights abuses. This includes potential violations of international human rights law or violations of international humanitarian law and other abuses. These controls have been in place in Canada for a long time. However, they were most recently comprehensively updated, after Canada acceded to something called the Arms Trade Treaty, or the ATT. Canada acceded to the ATT in 2019, And the ATT is a relatively new treaty. This is a UN treaty, and it was the first multilateral instrument that aimed to to regulate the international arms trade at a global scale to try to undermine the likelihood that international arms transfers could be used in human rights abuses. So that is where Canada's kind of current obligations stand. And it requires, again, the ATT requires that all Canadian arms exports have to be assessed. They must be permitted. So if a Canadian defense supplier wants to sell weapons to another country, that proposed sale has to be authorized by Canadian officials to ensure that it's not going to contribute to human rights abuses. So that all said, to get to the asterisk, the largest consumer of Canadian weapon systems in most given years is our southern neighbor, the United States. This should really come as no surprise. The U.S. not only has a voracious appetite for weapon systems, it's also the largest arms dealer in the world, and it's also Canada's closest economic partner. The vast majority, however, of Canada's arms exports to the United States occur with essentially zero oversight from Canadian officials. So this means that these arms sales that are produced from, within the GTA, more out in your neighborhood out west, really coast to coast to coast, the vast majority of these arms exports to the United States, and in some cases through the United States, are not subject to oversight by Canadian officials. The reason for this goes back to the 1950s, something called the Defense Production Sharing Agreement, or DPSA, put in place a series of loopholes whereby Canadian arms exports, which includes, full systems to some degree, but also the parts and components that comprise those systems, can be exported to the United States without any oversight. And unfortunately, those loopholes persisted throughout Canada's accession to the Arms Trade Treaty, the UNATT, and persist to this day. So with all that said, Bill C-233 is aiming to close those loopholes so that all Canadian arms exports are treated to the same degree. This would also mean that Canada would be in step with its international legal obligations under the UN Arms Trade Treaty. And it would also ensure that Canadian weapon systems are not being transferred to end users that Canadian officials would not authorize for export if those transfers were happening directly from Canadian soil.
Yeah, so there's people who have brought up critiques of Bill C-233. So let's walk through a few of those. Some would argue that the bill would decimate Canada's defense industry, or that it would weaken Canada's role in NATO. And I'm wondering if you can speak to those two points.
Sure thing. So the idea that Bill C-233 would decimate Canada's arms industry is coming from a place that if Canada's arms exports to the United States, so defense material produced in Canada and transferred to the Americans, if these exports required permits, licenses, then the U.S. would go elsewhere. This red tape would incur, much too many costs on Canadian defense suppliers. And this is kind of one of the arguments that we've heard. However, I think that it's important to look at things across the board and then also look at the moment that we're in. So first and foremost, this bill does not aim to stop Canadian arms exports to the United States, to just say flat out. And the idea that it is aiming to do that is resting on a false premise. All it is requiring is for Canada's arms exports to the U.S. to face the same regulatory scrutiny as exports to the rest of the world. So this would just bring Canadian arms transfers to the U.S. to the same degree, the same regulatory scrutiny that faces arms exports to the rest of the world. We can look and see that Canadian arms exports to other countries are huge, and they require case-by-case assessments. In a given year, Canada exports some years over $100 million worth of military goods to our partner in the United Kingdom. No one would say that Canada's regulatory requirements under the ATT is going to, has decimated Canadian arms trade with the UK. We can look at public numbers and see that we're exporting actually lots of weapon systems to the UK, and permits have had No issue with that. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say on regards to this notion that Bill C-233 would decimate Canada's defense industry is that we recently saw, with the new federal budget that came into play recently under the Carney government, that the federal government is actually pushing huge amounts of money into Canada's defense industrial base. So that would be all of Canada's producers of armaments to actually diversify where we're sending weapon systems. Explicitly to diversify, explicitly to look at places like Europe. Canada is also now the only non-European signatory to Rearm Europe, which is a program whereby European countries are looking to increase their ability to procure weapon systems. So to take it from this point, Canada is currently also looking to diversify its arms exports to the rest of the world. So the idea that Bill C-233 would somehow inhibit the Canadian defense industry, I think, is largely unfounded.
Yeah. So let's go into, I know there have been some recent reports from a number of NGOs based in Canada, probably work also that Ploughshares has done as well. But in terms of what the loophole allows, or where Canadian weapons go into an international context where human rights are violated or Canadian arms are implicated directly, be it in Gaza, in Yemen, in Somalia, other places. But wondering if you could give some examples through your own research you found in terms of where Canadian arms are being exported internationally and in violation of the Arms Trade Treaty.
Sure thing. So, I think the example that you started with, Gaza, is one of the better ones, if not also one of the most stark examples of where these loopholes allow for the export of Canadian weapon systems to problematic end users. So the United States is far and away the largest supplier of military aid to Israel. This has, been the case for decades. We're talking about billions of dollars a year in military aid through several means that flow from the U.S. government to Israel. And some of this military aid, if not much of it, obviously is, was used in or has been used throughout the current bombardment of Gaza. A military campaign that has killed tens of thousands of Palestinians and in which Israel faces consistent and credible allegations of violating international humanitarian law, including some allegations that would constitute war crimes. Canada, very early on in this conflict, in January 2024, took a rather principled step. And this step was Global Affairs Canada deciding that it was no longer going to authorize any new arms exports to Israel that could be used in Gaza. This was a bit of a half measure, right? It didn't stop all arms exports from Canada to Israel, but Global Affairs Canada, GAC, said the risk of violations of international humanitarian law with Canadian-made materiel in Gaza is too high, so we're going to stop new arms export authorizations. What this obviously did not stop was the transfer of Canadian weapon systems first to the United States and thereafterwards to Israel, including some of the types of technology that we know have been used in Israel's bombardment campaign in Gaza following the October 7th attack. So perhaps, one example I would highlight, we've certainly done at Ploughshares a lot of work on this, is Canadian technology that is integrated into the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, some of that technology, which is later supplied to the Israeli government. So Israel is one of a handful of states that are procuring the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with this platform, but this is a U.S.-made, Lockheed Martin-built, fifth-generation dual fighter bomber aircraft. This is kind of the newest, sexiest military aircraft available. And not only is Israel one of the countries that is procuring this aircraft, but Canada, over the life cycle of the Joint Strike Fighter program, has had more than 100 Canadian military suppliers involved in the program, producing components for the program that are made in Canada and then exported to Lockheed Martin for integration into these aircraft at the Lockheed Martin facility in Fort Worth. So if we look right now at the total value, at least our estimates at Ploughshares, of Canadian components that have been exported to the United States for later use in Israeli F-35s, that value would be something like $120 million. So put otherwise, the current total estimated value of Canadian technology that's been exported to the United States for use for later integration into F-35s destined for Israel sits at about $120 million Canadian. If we look at over the total life cycle of the Israeli F-35 program, Israel has 40 and change F-35s right now. They're under contract to eventually procure 75. The total value of Canadian technology that would flow through the United States into the Israeli F-35 program would sit at something closer to $232 million Canadian. These are huge values. These are huge values that would dwarf the total value of arms exports from Canada to Israel in any given year. So to state the obvious, what are the issues with this? Number one, if these arms exports were to be sent directly from Canada and not through the United States, not through these loopholes, then officials within GAC would deny them. That is the current policy of Global Affairs Canada and the federal government on its policy on arms transfers to Israel. So we know that this loophole is providing weapon systems to the Israeli government that, if going directly, would be violating the government of Canada's own provision on this topic. The second thing on this is that we know that, as has been reported by humanitarian and human rights monitors, that the main driver of civilian harm throughout Israel's campaign in Gaza has been the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, primarily being airstrikes. And one of the main vessels through which Israel has conducted airstrikes throughout Operation Swords of Iron has been through the F-35, the Israeli variant, which is called the F-35I. So the risk here is not speculative, right? The risk of supplying F-35 components to the United States, some of which are later going to Israel, the risk is not speculative. We know that there is a substantial risk that these pieces of technology would be used in violations of international humanitarian law. And that is the only kind of fair assessment to come to. So again, this is one of the ways through which Canadian military goods are ending up in places where they shouldn't be via the United States. And then, some other examples, one of the largest consumers of Canadian military goods, aside from the United States, would be Saudi Arabia. And again, I'm sure many of your listeners are aware of this. Saudi Arabia, the Saudi-Canadian arms trade has come under fire the last number of years. The largest arms contract in Canadian history, signed in 2014, was for $14 billion worth of what are called light armored vehicles. These are basically wheeled tanks produced in London, Ontario by a General Dynamics plant for the Saudi government, for the Saudi Royal Guard. However, although that contract, rightfully so, has received a lot of scrutiny, and certainly we've done a lot of work on it. And it should be said that these labs, some of the labs that Canada has sent to Saudi Arabia, ended up in places like the war in Yemen, another conflict which, killed more than 377,000 people by UN estimates. Some of Canada's other large arms contracts for LAVs to Saudi Arabia were sourced initially through the U.S. government. So a good example would have been the immediate contracts that happened prior to the 2014 deal. This is a contract that was valued at more than $2 billion for additional labs. And this contract would have never happened if it was not routed through the U.S. government. It should also be noted that that contract was actually for end use by the Saudi National Guard, not the Royal Guard. And the Saudi National Guard was the component of the Saudi government, the Saudi military, that we did see very active throughout the war in Yemen. So again, this is another example of where Canadian weapon systems are ending up where they shouldn't be through the U.S. government. Yeah.
Thanks, Kelsey. So I'm just going to, raise a couple of points that other critics have brought up to the legislation. One of which is that it would delay critical Canadian support to Ukraine, or that this would somehow harm the Canadian Armed Forces' access to equipment, although I don't understand how that's a critique, given we're talking about exports in the bill and not imports. But if you could speak to those 2 points in terms of Canadian support in Ukraine, and any kind of implications for Canadian armed forces.
Yeah. So, I mean, just on the CAF angle, well, I mean, you said it yourself, right? This is an export focused bill, not an import focused bill. So, I think that that's quite a tenuous argument. Something could be said perhaps about some Canadian made military goods for eventual procurement by the Department of National Defense. They might include American components, so they could cross over the border once or twice. But again, this would be for re-export. This would also, if we saw the passing of Bill C-233, it would simply just require any component transfers back and forth from the Canadian government to the U.S. government to be treated like all other transfers around the world. So again, I'm not sure where that argument comes into play, but in particular, again, this is an export-focused bill, not an import-focused bill. And on Ukraine, so there is currently no evidence that Bill C-233 would hamper the provision of military aid to Ukraine, and that's from the outset. That is in large part because most of what Canada provides to Ukraine in the form of military aid is either sent to our European allies first or sent directly to Ukraine. So there's no kind of transiting through the United States. Furthermore, transfers of Canadian military aid, including to Ukraine, are authorized and exported through a parallel system performed by officials within the Department of National Defense. The export of military aid does not follow the same export permitting criteria that kind of traditional arms exports follows. It's a streamlined process. So even if some of these exports were some of Canadian military aid to Ukraine were transferring into the hands of American authorities, Bill C-233 wouldn't apply anyways. The provisions of this bill wouldn't apply anyways because military aid is transferred through a parallel process.
Yeah. Kelsey, I'm wondering if we can speak just a little bit to, there's a number of other countries that have not just signed on to the ATT, but have acceded to the treaty. And I'm wondering if you can speak to, what are other countries doing who have signed on to the ATT, or look like in other contexts when you have a proper system that is following what the ATT is intended to do, both in policy design, but also in practice.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the Arms Trade Treaty is quite clear and I think quite fair in what it calls on states to do, right? So Article 5 of the Arms Trade Treaty requires that states parties, being those states that have acceded to it, like Canada, implement the treaty in a consistent and non-discriminatory fashion, which put otherwise means that you have to introduce the criteria of the treaty into your own domestic control system in a consistent way. That means that there can't be entire swaths of the world that are exempt from a permitting process, that are exempt from human rights oversight. And when we're looking at the treaty and it calls for the provisions of the treaty itself to be implemented consistently, that requires that all states parties assess exports against two operative articles of the treaty itself, Article 6 and Article 7. So Article 6 requires states parties to, again, assess all exports, arms exports around the world on a case-by-case basis to ensure that they're not going to be used writ large in war crimes. If a states party has knowledge that they will be used in war crimes and other kind of egregious violations of international law, then a transfer cannot happen. It would be unlawful. Once the Article 6 assessment is completed, states parties assess exports under Article 7, which is the risk assessment criteria. And under Article 7, states parties have to conduct a risk assessment to ensure that individual proposed exports, that there is not a substantial risk that they could be used in violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. So this is a bit of a lower threshold than Article 6. We're looking at risk. So looking at how states parties around the world have implemented this, the best countries that have implemented the ATT take these two articles quite seriously and introduce them in a consistent and non-discriminatory manner as is required under Article 5. Canada's current arms control regime, with these exemptions that are placed on arms exports to, and again, in some cases through the United States, is flagrantly out of line with these obligations, because this is a discriminatory way to introduce the Arms Trade Treaty, right? To exempt your biggest importer of weapon systems from some of these core provisions of the treaty. There's been some talk that, where Canada does place permitting exemptions on U.S. destined military goods, Canada actually applies these exemptions more narrowly than all other states parties. And I would say that there really is no reason to believe that. I mean, some states parties do have more flexible licensing criteria in some cases. So the example that we've given before, the UK has something called an open general export license, which essentially allows for multiple arms exports to be authorized at once. And there's not really values that are associated. However, all of these open general export licenses, while problematic and while a deviation from the UK's obligations under the ATT, are still authorized by British officials. And to some degree, they're still reported transparently, something that is not the case with the vast majority of Canada's arms exports to the United States, right? There's zero oversight on these. There's literally not a licensing process. And as a result of that, none of these arms exports that are subject to these loopholes, which are the vast majority of Canada's arms exports to the United States, are transparently published to the public. So there are certainly countries that do it better than Canada. And the notion that Canada applies exemptions more narrowly than any other state's party is really not founded. Again, when the largest consumer of Canadian arms exports is exempt from oversight, there's no way that Canada can say that its arms control regime is better than the rest.
Yeah, I'm wondering as well, Kelsey, if you could share examples of re-export clauses where a country has exported to another country, but there's conditions placed on those arms going to a third or fourth country, or a context in which it's part of a broader accountability mechanism. I'm wondering if you could share any examples of that in an international context where it works well.
Well, I think any licensing or permitting process that has a re-export clause is really just following what they have to do under the Arms Trade Treaty, right? Like, without re-export clauses, end use monitoring doesn't really exist, right? So whenever a permit is approved, there has to be an end user included. This is not unique to Canada. This is just a standard around the world. And this is really how you conduct risk assessments. You look at who the end user is. So that would include, if it's going to a foreign government, it would include that country. If it's going to an individual, it would include the country of residence of the individual. And then you look at the potential human rights ramifications of transferring to that entity. If someone is going to export a weapon system, and then the importer of that weapon system is knowingly going to retransfer immediately, that would arguably be what we would call diversion, right? So the exported material is going to an end user that was not authorized by the exporting party. And so I would say any export control regime that doesn't include some level of retransfer considerations, that doesn't place some emphasis on re-export considerations, would not have much of a strong export control regime in the first place.
And Kelsey, I'm wondering if you could maybe share, this is one aspect of trying to close this American loophole, but given your broader research happening in the Canadian context, I'm wondering if you can maybe place this legislation in context, but also maybe speak broadly about other policies that you think ought to be brought in the Canadian context that would ensure both accountability, but also that Canadian arms wouldn't be used in human rights violations abroad.
Sure thing. So to contextualize this, I would say that, Canada does have a mature arms control regime. And this was the case even before Canada acceded to the Arms Trade Treaty. There's issues with it, certainly. And there were instances of Canada authorizing arms exports that certainly Project Ploughshares thought were out of line with Canada's arms control regime, including to countries like Saudi Arabia. And then, of course, we we later saw those weapon systems deployed to conflicts like that in Yemen. But that all said, compared to much of the world, Canada does have a mature and functioning arms control regime. The central flaw in that regime, though, is exactly what this bill is trying to close. And that is, again, the fact that, that Canada's biggest arms trade customer, the United States, most of the exports that Canada undertakes to the U.S. in any given year are not subject to controls. So that is all to say that this is really the central longstanding loophole and issue with Canada's control regime dating back to the 1950s. And I think closing this loophole is really an opportunity that should not be missed. In terms of other legislation, I mean, I wouldn't even go as far as legislation. I would just say, some other things that Project Ploughshares has called for Canada to change in regards to its export control regime. Something that's come up recently would certainly be aspects related to end use monitoring. So over the last number of years, we've seen Canadian weapon systems, again, permeate conflicts that they shouldn't be. If it's drone technology being used in Nagorno-Karabakh, or if it's recently precision sniper rifles produced in British Columbia, actually, that have appeared in the conflict in Sudan. We're seeing weapon systems, Canadian-made weapon systems, that are being diverted illicitly. And this is happening after they reach the initial importer of those weapon systems, after the point of export. One way that some countries, mostly European states, have tried to deal with diversion is by introducing what's called post-shipment controls, or end-use monitoring, it's sometimes called. There's different names, but these are mechanisms that would allow Canadian officials to proactively ensure that Canadian-made military goods are not being misused abroad. This would introduce tools into the Canadian toolkit that would, at the ceiling, kind of looking at it through a maximalist lens, it would allow Canadian officials to actually go into foreign countries and ensure that Canadian weapon systems are not being misused, or at the very least, they are where they're supposed to be, right? That's certainly one thing we've called for. And it's something that I think the government of Canada should really look into. There are good examples of, again, European allies introducing post-shipment controls. There's also been a lot written on this over the last number of years. Organizations like the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, has released some really good guidance material on this. And I think it's something that Canadian officials should look at, particularly if we don't see this bill pass. There's this continued threat of Canadian weapon systems flowing to the U.S. to places where we wouldn't authorize those exports if going directly. I also think that Canada can and should look at other countries in regards to transparency. So Canada has a national, we would call a national report. So Canada reports its arms exports annually in something we generally refer to as the annual report on military exports. Its name has kind of changed over the years, but this is a report that lists the total value of arms exports to each country that occurred in the prior calendar year, with the obvious exemption of the United States for all the reasons we've discussed. And Canada's reporting is good in some regards, but I think that it could be improved in many ways, right? So again, if we look at some of Canada's European allies, for instance, the Netherlands, the Dutch report much more than the government of Canada reports. When we look at Canada's reporting on arms exports around the world, it's usually kind of aggregate values of these obscure categories of military goods, and then the country of their destination. This is really not accessible to the Canadian public. You have to understand how Canada's export control list works and what these codes mean. Sometimes it can be actually quite misleading as well. So I think a much more granular and disaggregated approach towards reporting arms exports would be beneficial. Again, if we look at the Dutch example, this is not an annual report. This is actually an online resource that's, if I remember correctly, that's updated quarterly. And you can go on, see where the government of the Netherlands has export of weapon systems to. It includes disaggregated exports. So each export is reported. It includes, for instance, the manufacturers involved. And the Dutch also report things that Canada doesn't report: dual-use goods, the export of dual-use goods, something that's grown, that's received a lot of attention over the last number of years due to the increasing reliance of dual-use goods in modern conflicts like that in Ukraine. So I think certainly in terms of transparency, this is something that the government of Canada can, these are some steps that the government of Canada could take to really be able to brag and say that we have the best control regime in the world, because at this point, that's not the case.
Kelsey, and I guess my last question, if there's anything you'd like to add related to Bill C-233 to our audience on why they should support it and what they can do, if you could share any last thoughts on Bill C-233.
Yeah. Again, reflecting on some of the arguments against Bill C-233 that we've seen, some of these include that, the passing of the bill would kind of put Canada out of step with our allies and would, weaken Canada's place in NATO. And I really think, the opposite is true, right? The majority of Canada's NATO partners are states parties to the Arms Trade Treaty. I think it's 30 out of the 32 member NATO alliance, 30 of NATO member states are ATT states parties, with the other two, Turkey and the US, being signatories. So bringing Canada's control system closer in line with its obligations under international law, I don't think should be controversial. We would only be bringing ourselves up to the standard of Canada's allies, right? All this bill is trying to do is to harmonize and standardize Canadian controls as it relates to the Canadian arms trade. It is just trying to treat all customers with the same regulatory brush. And I don't think really there should be anything controversial about, following Canada's international legal obligations.
Kelsey, thank you so much for joining us on Below the Radar. We're going to link to a report from Ploughshares and a link to a parliamentary petition. This will be voted on in late February in the House of Commons, so keep an eye out on it. Kelsey, thank you so much for joining us on Below the Radar.
My pleasure, Anne. Thanks.
Below the Radar is a Knowledge Democracy podcast originally created by SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. The Below the Radar B-sides are supported by Vancity Credit Union. Thanks for listening to this episode with Kelsey Gallagher. Find out more about his work in the show notes below. If you're interested in learning more about Bill C-233, you can attend a public forum held by the SFU Center for Comparative Muslim Studies on January 30th, 2026. Details are below. Thanks for tuning in.